right now. Okay, welcome everybody to our eBay presentation today. I'm Trevor. I'll be your presenter, and we have a really specific topic we're going to go over today. The topic is going to be on canceling a transaction, which for most of you guys, especially you guys that are here live, I know I've worked with some of you personally on getting a transaction canceled. And I guess what I mean by that is, when you're on eBay and you make a sale, at that point, you either need to do one of two things, right? You either need to fulfill the sale, make sure your supplier ships out the product, or you ship out the product. Or if there's something that's gone amiss and we can't fulfill the order, we need to make sure we cancel it. Now, I'm sure some of you guys could probably give me some situations. And in fact, for those of you guys who have been selling on eBay for a little bit, under what situations would you ever need to cancel an order with a customer? Give me some examples, because I want to hear from you guys first. I'm going to give you some examples of situations where this would be appropriate, but you guys tell me, and based on your experience, when have you had to cancel a transaction and why, is my question. Kirk hit the first one that I think is probably going to be the biggest on everybody's mind. The item's out of stock, maybe. B, you said it as well. Items no longer available, which that does happen, doesn't it? Because when you're using a drop shipper, you don't have full control over their inventory, right? Like they're giving you access to their inventory, but there's going to be occasion where you make a sale, you go back to your supplier, and guess what? It's out of stock, right? And we hope that doesn't happen often. And with some experience of setting up with good suppliers and finding good reliable products that are usually in stock, you don't have that problem too often, or you shouldn't. But I know a lot of you guys have run into that. So out of stock is definitely an issue. Jane just brought one up that happens where, and maybe some of you guys aren't aware of this, but sometimes on eBay, especially if you run like an auction, the winning person who wins the auction, at that point they're given notice to pay, right? And so if we're all bidding on an item and I win the auction, eBay will usually email me something that says, "Hey Trevor, congratulations, you won the auction, now you need to pay." And at that point, I'll go ahead and pay. But sometimes customers, I don't know if it's because like they actually change their mind last minute or whatever, but they don't pay. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen sometimes. And if you get somebody who doesn't pay, that would be a situation where we'd also probably want to cancel the transaction. Let me see if there's other situations here that I'd written down. This happens sometimes. This kind of goes along with maybe running out of stock, but let's say the buyer buys an item from you and you go back to your supplier and you actually try to ship it and you can't because they're in kind of an odd destination. This has happened to me before, especially with larger orders. There was a time where I was doing, especially during the summer, where I did a lot of outdoor furniture, and sometimes I would make a sale and my customers sort of like out in the middle of nowhere, right? Some small town. I can't even remember the last one. It was somewhere in Montana. And my supplier was just like, "Oh, sorry, we actually don't deliver there," right? And it's like, well, okay. So I had to contact the person and get the transaction canceled. So stuff like that can happen. Yeah, maybe the buyer changes their mind. I guess we could probably list scenario after scenario. But the bottom line is, if it hasn't happened to you where something fouls up after a sale is made, it's going to at some point. And I want to make sure we cover how to successfully cancel a transaction and some tips on doing it the right way and what some of the risks are. And so that way, the next time it happens for you guys, you feel like you can handle the situation pretty well. So let's talk about what happens for a sec. Let's say, all right, let's take this scenario. Let's say somebody buys an item, and let's say it's that situation where I win an auction, and I choose not to pay for some reason. So I'm the customer in this case. I win an auction. I don't end up paying. I changed my mind. You as the seller, you're emailing me saying, hey, go ahead and pay for this item, and I never get back to you. So if you've never collected any money as a seller, the question is, do you actually need to cancel the transaction? Like, do you need to officially cancel it? Because in the end, you never collected money, and even though they committed to buy it, they never sent you any money. So do we still need to go through this process of officially canceling it through eBay? And if so, why is it that we would need to still do it? I'll give you guys a sec to respond. It would be different, right? If, let's say, I had paid and then later changed my mind, right? Which every once in a while might happen. Somebody buys an item, later changes their mind, and wants to cancel the order. I'm getting some feedback here. Yep, Jane says to get fees back. Karen says, yes, same. B, oh, for feedback's purposes, maybe, yeah. I can tell you, yeah, that's true. Maybe for feedback. Let's talk about each one of those. First of all, fees for a second. I think that's probably the main reason I would be really motivated to make sure I cancel the order, because if you sell something, let's say you sell something for $150, what do you have to pay eBay at that point? What do you owe eBay once that sale's made? Yeah, it's right. It's 10%. Like we've talked about before, eBay fees are usually 10%. So eBay doesn't really even care if you've collected money on it or not. What they say is if you make a sale on eBay, they assume that you collect money somehow, whether it be through PayPal or maybe somebody wrote you a check and mailed it to you. Whatever the case may be, they're going to assume that you actually got paid unless you cancel the transaction. So you sell that item for $150, even if you never get paid for it, eBay is going to bill you $15, and they're going to expect you to pay that as their commission, because they operate on the assumption that you in fact were paid. Now, we know that we weren't, so we need to cancel the transaction. That way we can get reimbursed or not charged that final value fee, if that makes sense. So I would argue to you guys that that's probably the main reason. Maybe for feedback, I mean, we want to have a successful experience, like a good positive experience with the buyer. And so, maybe we can do this the right way just so we can make sure we get good feedback. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But just suffice it to say, the main reason why we really worry about this is I don't want you guys to still get billed 10% for eBay if a transaction just doesn't successfully go through, because you shouldn't have to, because you never actually got paid. Okay. Now let me show you guys. This is eBay's official policy that we're looking at right now, and I'll sort of highlight this is the web address right up here. Hopefully you can see that. I know it's kind of small, but the web address is pages.ebay.com/help/cancel-transaction-process.html. So again, hopefully you guys can read that. Let me see if I can put it somewhere else. It's not big enough. This is what it looks like right here. That's the web address. Okay. Or, I mean, better yet, if it's easy for you guys, just go to Google and type in cancel transaction eBay. The first one that comes up, if you click on that, that'll take you into the same screen. Okay. So this is kind of their official stance on it. I'm just going to read you guys a couple of things to consider here. At the top, it says occasionally you may need to cancel a transaction. For instance, if the item is broken, or you made a mistake when listing the item, or let's add to that, if the item for us ran out of stock, etc. Some of the reasons we listed earlier. If you sold an item but can't complete the sale, you may be able to cancel the transaction in the My eBay section. when I say your My eBay section, really what I'm talking about is if you're here on eBay. So let's go out to like the eBay home page here. Okay, here we are. It's this section right here, right? This link up here is My eBay. So we click on that, and that takes you into sort of like your main selling and buying section. So you've got this menu over here on the left for sell, purchase history, buy, etc. Okay, this is your My eBay section. So that's where you go if you want to actually start the process of canceling a transaction. I'll show you how here in just a minute. When you need to cancel a transaction, it's generally a good practice to first contact your buyer to let the buyer know you're canceling the transaction and why. So there's two situations that can happen here, guys. You can either, as a seller, request to cancel a transaction, or the buyer can request to cancel a transaction. It can happen either way. But formally, when it's done, either you initiate it or the buyer initiates it and attempts to cancel the transaction. Okay. It'll give you some details about how long you can do. I'm not going to read through this right here. I want to show you guys where to start. This is the process officially right here. To cancel a transaction, you go to My eBay and then you go to your sold section. Okay. So here's your sold section right here. Under My eBay, your left-hand column right here, you've got your sell menu. For some of you guys, it might just show sell, and then you click the arrow next to it, and you'll see your sold section right here, okay? So you click on sold, right? And you'll see some listings that'll come up if you've sold a couple of items. And then you go over to this little More Actions link, and you click the down button right there, and then you can do cancel order, or resolve a problem. For most of you guys, it should show up as cancel order, and that's what eBay shows right here. Select cancel this order. So there it is right there, More Actions and cancel order. But just so you guys know too, this is where a lot of the magic happens is under More Actions. So you can contact the buyer right here if you need to. There's your cancel order. You can view the PayPal transaction. You can add a little note next to the item if you need to make a note of something. If you're having a problem with the buyer, you can report them. But there's a lot of stuff that you can do here. The cancel transaction though, or cancel order, that's where this is all going to happen. Okay, now I won't. The rest is pretty self-explanatory. I won't show you that whole process. Like it'll bring up a screen where it'll essentially ask you why you're canceling it, and then once you fill out that reason, eBay then goes and notifies the buyer and says, "Hey, Trevor here wants to cancel this transaction, and here's why." And I'll have a little message that'll say something like, "I'm really sorry. We're out of stock right this second. We don't have it. We could just say we don't have it in stock, but we'll get back to you. Whatever your message is, you'll put it there, and that's what the buyer will receive." Okay. So at that point, the buyer then can respond back, and they can either accept the cancellation or reject it. And in most cases, it's very rare that a buyer would reject the cancellation. So they'll probably just accept it. And then what will happen is eBay will then refund those final value fees. They'll automatically deduct that from your invoice that month, and then the deal's done. Okay. So that's kind of the process that you'll go through. You'll want to do what's important here though is if it is an out of stock issue, you got to have a really, really good explanation to the buyer, because the way eBay works technically is, the minute you list something on eBay for sale, you're committing to actually fulfill that order. And if you show a history of consistently not filling that or fulfilling that commitment, sometimes that can hurt your standing with eBay, right? And I know some of you guys, and I even recognize some names here right now, I know some of you guys have run into that issue where you've had quite a few out of stock issues lately, especially some of you guys who are just starting and kind of getting a feel for different suppliers. And you're finding especially that this time of year over the holidays, sometimes it can, big retailers and some suppliers go in and out of stock all the time. So whatever you guys write there, and I might ask you guys, for those of you who have been successful and have sent somebody a message about being out of stock, I'd be curious to hear from you. What have you found to be effective? Like in that message that you send explaining the situation before you try to cancel that transaction, what do you tell your buyer? Specifically about an out of stock issue? Because they're going to be a little frustrated by that. In most cases, they will be, because when you buy something on eBay, you know, if it's listed, you expect it to be available, or else in the buyer's mind, it's like, well, why did you list it then? You know what I mean? So what do we say there in that message back to the buyer? I'm just waiting here for some feedback, so don't let the silence bother you. I'm starting to see some come in right now. Catherine brings up a point. She says, Trevor, should I have used cancel order on this morning's out of stock item instead of contact buyer? Well, let me give you a reason why we might want to contact the buyer before we send them the cancellation. Sometimes if you sell an item where there's, you know, let's say, this might have been the one we're talking about here, Catherine. I can't remember, but I know Catherine had sold an item recently that was unavailable in a certain color, right? Wasn't it a bag, Catherine? I'm trying to remember. This might not be the one you're talking about now, but just for the sake of this example, you had sold this bag that was sort of like a tan color, right? And that wasn't available. That had gone out of stock, but there were a couple other colors available, or there's some alternatives available maybe. And so if that ever happens, and you've searched online everywhere, and by the way, you guys should, if your item's out of stock, you should really go out to like google.com/shopping and do a search for it, okay? Like really actually that, and go and look. I'll just show you. Most of you guys have probably seen this, but I'm going to show you anyway. Google.com/shopping and do a search for it here. Google Shopping will automatically go out there and basically look at all the other retailers and people who sell a certain item. You just type in the item name there and let you know who's carrying it and for what price. So sometimes that's a good way to quickly see if you do run out of stock from your specific supplier. Maybe you can go out and find it somewhere else for, you know, close to the same price, or, you know, maybe even right at break even, or even you lose a couple of bucks, but it's always worth it to at least fulfill the order. So that's a good place to go. So the first thing should be, is there, I mean, this should come across your mind, is there an alternative? Like, could I go back to the buyer first and say, look, it ran out of stock in tan. We've looked for it everywhere. It's just not available, but I actually have some stock of the red color and the teal color or whatever. Would you like that? I like to give people options. I'll usually say, well, hey, we can either give you either one of these two colors, and then I'll notify you immediately if that other tan color comes back in, or we'll just refund you right on the spot. I like to have that communication first. So if you've got alternatives, maybe you do that. You could even contact the buyer if it's an item that just barely went out of stock and might come back into stock. You might want to go to the buyer and contact them first and say, look, we just barely ran out, but there's a good chance it'll come in the next couple of days. We can either A, refund you right now, or B, wait a couple of days and see if it comes back in. And you guys would be surprised how many people are pretty willing to work with you on stuff like that. So I guess the one point I want to make before I look through some of your guys' suggestions is, when you are contacting your buyer, give them options. That's so powerful for most people, because if you say, sorry, I just have to refund you, I don't have it in stock, it feels a little like, I don't have an option as a buyer. But sometimes if you can go to them and say, look, I don't have it in stock right now, so I can either A, refund you, or B, we can wait a couple of days because it might be back in. Sometimes that empowers the buyer a little bit, and they feel a little better about it. So anyway, I would always try to approach them with options, if that makes sense. Let's see some of your other suggestions. Yeah, Vince just made the same point that I was just making right there. Vince says, I tell them it's out of stock. Would they like to wait for it? Or would they like to wait for it to come in or receive a refund? Perfect, Vince. That's exactly what you should do. It empowers them a little bit. I'm going to read yours, B, if that's okay. B said, I just had one and informed the buyer it was no longer available in the color prior to canceling it. The buyer gave a positive response. That's fantastic. So good. You can still work out some positive feedback if you guys just handle it okay. Let me look through a couple of your guys' other ones. This is from Stephanie. Told one person an item was back ordered for a week. He replied asking for confirmation. Fortunately, I was able to find another source to fulfill the item. Good. So do that extra step and always look for another one. But did have to pay a little more to keep him happy. So that's a good question. Is it worth it then to do it, right? Like if you guys lose a couple of bucks on the transaction, would it be better just to cancel it or lose a couple of bucks? And I would argue, especially for you guys that have newer accounts that are just starting to sell, I would always opt to lose a couple of bucks. We'll make up that 3, 4, 5 bucks you lose. I mean, I guess it's one thing if you were going to lose like 25, 30, 40, 50 bucks, maybe then we definitely cancel it. But right, like if you went out and found it at a different source and it was more expensive, it might not be worth it if it's quite that extreme. But we really want to impress eBay right now, and we don't want to cause any problems for our account. So where possible, I really would do what Stephanie did there and just go out and try to find another source for it. Catherine, you made it. Yeah, you make a good point. See here, let me read Catherine's response, and then we'll just about finish up with this part and move on to the next. But she said, I said, thank you for the purchase. Unfortunately, the item is just out of stock. If you'd like a different color, XYZ is available in this size, etc. I can get that immediately from my supplier. If you prefer the original, I can check the supplier and contact you as soon as possible. Otherwise, I can give you a full refund. So that's such a good response, right? I feel a little more empowered as a buyer if that's the response I get from the seller. And as another point, guys, if you can do that fairly quickly, if something runs out of stock, don't just sit and wait on it and hope it comes back in without contacting the buyer first. Contact them first and let them know that that's what's going on. Because I would be pretty frustrated if I was a buyer and I bought something and then 3 days later you came back to me and said, oh, well, you know what? Sorry, it's out of stock, but here's your options. I'd want to know right away for sure. Okay, so Vince asks, how would I know it barely ran out? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess you can't really know that it did just barely run out. I usually like to say that because when I listed it, it was in stock, and then when I sold it, it wasn't. But a good rule of thumb with certain suppliers, you can always contact your supplier and say, hey, is XYZ product, is it coming back into stock soon? Or is it back ordered completely or discontinued? I mean, is it coming back in? So sometimes you can have that conversation with your supplier. Okay, let's move on just to the next thing for a sec. You guys have provided a lot of really, really good feedback, so I appreciate that. Let me read through something else in this policy that's kind of interesting. Let me see if I can find it. I had it just before. I should have highlighted it for myself. Okay, let me look here. Refund the buyer. In terms of refunding, we might talk that more in detail about that later. But this is sort of how you refund. You can refund directly through PayPal, but if you do cancel the order and agree to a refund through the official eBay cancellation process, it'll automatically be refunded. So that works too. You get your final value fee credit like we talked about, so that 10% you get back. And then, here's what I wanted to share with you guys. If you cancel a transaction, okay, so if you as a seller, if you cancel a transaction, the buyer can still leave you negative or neutral feedback about the transaction. Or in B's case, they can leave you positive feedback. So the bottom line is, just because you cancel the transaction and your buyer agrees to cancel it, that doesn't mean for 1 minute that they can't still leave feedback on your account about how that transaction went, right? That's pretty important to note, because if they leave, like if overall they're not very happy with the experience, if you didn't get in there and communicate well, give them options like we talked about, and really help them understand what happened, etc., right? If you don't do a good job of what we just talked about before, they may get on and ding you for a negative feedback. And that's a problem, because if we get too many negative feedbacks, that can hurt our account with eBay. You could even get your account closed down. That is possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. You can get your account closed down for that. Neutral feedbacks don't hurt you, by the way. So if you guys ever get a neutral feedback, that's not such a bad thing. That doesn't hurt you. It's the negatives that hurt. So that's why even in the end, if they agree to cancel that transaction, you have got to make sure they had some sort of a positive experience with you. I mean, they've got to walk away saying, oh, yeah, XYZ product wasn't in stock and that was a little irritating, but boy, this seller emailed me right back. They were friendly. They were courteous. They gave me options. We don't want to give people a reason to be mad to the point where they leave us negative feedback. And ultimately, guys, like, you can do all these things that we've outlined today, but I promise you, even if you do this perfectly to a T, you're still gonna get the occasional buyer that they're gonna be a jerk about it. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I've done this long enough to know that you get some buyers that are just so incredibly unreasonable that they're just gonna be a jerk, and they might ring you up with a negative feedback, and there's nothing you can do about it. That'll just happen. And it'll happen because occasionally you might run out of stock and run into this, okay? But I'd say in most cases, if you guys will just do some good customer service like we're talking about today, like, I just don't think that'll happen to you very often. And when it does, it'll be the rarity. So keep that in mind. That's why we're focusing so much on the customer service side of things. All right, let me see if I missed anything that I wanted to cover. Yeah, I've got one last point that I want to touch on before I let you guys go. This page right here, make sure you look it over in detail. I gave you that specific address because I knew we wouldn't have time. I mean, we're covering the high points in this call, but I want you guys to actually look at this in detail so you understand it a little bit better. Okay, let's see. Yeah, here's the last point I want to make. So going back to the fact that sometimes you can't avoid this, I've had some really good sellers before that I've worked with over the years that, like, they'll do such a good job with their drop shipping and their customer service, and then every once in a while, like, you're making sales and you might have an issue where you run out of stock a couple of times or whatever, or maybe it's you run out of stock once, or the item arrives and it's broken, or whatever the case may be, and the person's mad about it. They want to cancel the transaction, get their money back and stuff. And it's situations that you can't control, right? You've done everything you can and you can't control it, and you get a couple of negative feedback right in a row, or you get several in a month's time. The thing is your feedback, I mean, getting negative feedbacks early on when you're not making a lot of sales can really hurt your account. When you're bigger and you're making lots of sales and you're doing thousands of transactions, maybe hundreds of transactions a month for some of you guys who are just starting, that it's not that big of a deal. Like, you can get a negative feedback, a couple of times out of 100 transactions and still have a pretty good account with eBay. It's when you start getting, 10% of your transactions are negative, that kind of thing, where you can run into some real trouble. So I've found over the years, and for some of you guys here that are my clients, I think I've made the suggestion to you guys. I've found that because drop shipping can be somewhat inconsistent at times, depending on your supplier, especially if you're using some of the larger retailers that aren't working with you quite as well. I mean, eventually you ought to be working with good wholesalers, specific wholesale drop shippers, maybe even some really good sort of specific retailers that you have good relationships with. Like, we want to have those kind of relationships so we don't run into a lot of out of stock issues. But If it does happen that you start getting into an issue where you're running into a lot of out of stock issues, the best thing that I've ever found in that situation is pad your stats a little bit by buying a little bit of product out of China and selling it either at cost or where you're just making a little bit on it, and that'll pad your feedback. Like, for example, I had one guy a few years ago. The only thing he sold was high-end furniture. So, he may only make one sale a day, 30 sales a month. But he's making, $100 or $150 profit per sale. So, like, he's doing okay doing that, but after all, there's still only 30 sales a month. So if he gets one negative out of those 30 transactions, like, his feedback score isn't great. If he gets 2 or 3, he's in real trouble because he's at that 10% mark. So what we did with him is, just to ensure that we never fell below sort of like eBay quality standards for their sellers, we went out there to China. And I know you guys have seen this because I brought it up in other webinars and stuff. This is AliExpress.com. It's a good place to get, Chinese products for cheap. He went out there and started supplementing his business. So he would sell mostly this furniture, and that's where he was making his money. But he would also buy iPhone cases or chargers or, small accessories or whatever, jewelry, you name it, and get it really cheap here. Not drop ship it, but buy it for himself in small quantity. Don't spend a lot. Buy it for yourself and then sell it on eBay at just dirt cheap prices so that you're moving it and you're selling quite a few, and that'll help pad your stats so that he's not just doing 30 transactions a month now. He's doing 80 transactions a month. And yeah, he's making most of his money off of his normal dropship sales, but those other transactions he has, like, that's bolstering his feedback and he has complete control, right? Because he's carrying his own inventory. He never runs out into any out of stock issues. So my best advice for you guys who are concerned because you're having a lot of out of stock issues, I seriously would come here and pad your stats. Sell some stuff from home, source some stuff out of China, do some things that you can control just to keep your feedback score up, and that'll make a big difference. For more detail on this strategy, just for those of you guys who haven't seen this one, in our webinar section on our website, scroll down and check out international product sourcing for eBay. We're going to do more webinars on that, but that's a good high-level one that'll help you guys, get involved in that kind of a strategy if you need to. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. Let me see go ahead and ask any other questions really quick before we finish up. We're going to finish up and let you guys enjoy the rest of your day. We're going to add this to the list here on our webinars so that you guys can refer to this again if you feel like you need to. Make sure you refer to that web page I was showing you earlier, the canceling your transaction page, the official one from eBay. And then hopefully you guys don't ever really have any big issues with this. You keep an account in good standing. Hopefully rarely the out of stock issue happens, but inevitably it will. This is the best way to handle it. And so hopefully this was helpful for you guys. All right, so Catherine's got a couple of questions. You guys, we're gonna finish up the recording right now. I'm just gonna turn it off. Again, for those of you guys who are seeing this recorded later, hopefully this was helpful. Contact your coach if you need any clarification on any of this.